Thanks so much, Federico, and good afternoon, everyone. By a show of hands, how many of you work in the SOC? Very nice. I see a lot of hands. And second question, how many of you ever investigate security incident during holidays? Well, I still see a lot of hands. That's great. So we have certainly investigated a lot of security incidents for our customer. And what we find out is that incident happens in enterprise today, not because there's no alert. It's mainly because people don't have time to perform consistent and high-quality security investigations. Now, why is that? Alert fatigue is a common problem. If you look at a typical mid to large enterprise, they can receive anywhere from thousands to tens of thousands alerts per day. And most of these are either false positives or benign positives. And among these, most of them are medium and low severity alerts. So what happens in reality is that SOC teams either start to ignore the medium and low severity alert because it's so overwhelming, or they will start to do shallow investigations, or they will just say, hey, let's suppress these noisy alerts, because most of the time they're just false positives. So in this talk, we particularly want to focus on EDR. And EDR is, as we know, it's one of the most important detection categories in the SOC. And one of the things that we find that's interesting is many times when we work with an enterprise, people rely on the default configuration of the detection of the EDR. And very rarely, people will program custom detections on top of, in addition to that. And we will talk about 4 principles that the attacker can use to actually mutate these TTPs that initially trigger critical and high alert into low, medium, and even no alert. And these principles doesn't require any complex kernel hacking skills, and it's fairly easy to carry out. We will also show that the experiment that we show is based on evaluation on some of the popular EDR tools, CrowdStrike, MS Defender, and SentinelOne. And we will show that how these experiments are done on these tools. So really quickly, self-intro. I'm Rex Guo, and work in security for 16 years. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Culminate. We built an advanced AI SOC agent that investigates all the alerts consistently and with high quality. And one of the highlights that we did last year at DEF CON is in DEF CON SOC competition, we publicly proved that AI SOC analyst plus human SOC analyst can 12 times the output of a human-only team. Before this, I was building EDR, XDR, and CNAPP in various different companies. And this is the first time I'm back in Black Hat. Thank you so much, Black Hat, for inviting me back.
All right, and I'm Kang. I'm a founding security researcher at Culminate. I started in the industry doing binary analysis and vuln research, and then later on I moved over to full stack exploitations. And beside working in security, aka hacking for money, I also enjoy playing and hacking FPS games. And for the purpose of this presentation, I will be presenting the offense side of things.
Okay, before we dive into the actual technical detail, just to explain the different severity definition on different tools. So you can see CrowdStrike EDR has 4 different severity levels. Microsoft Defender has 3, and SentinelOne has 2. And across the entire talk, our goal is to move these alerts from the top of the iceberg to the bottom of the iceberg.
Okay, so the first scenario that we'll be presenting will be an attacker compromising a Linux server workload and perform data exfil. So there are a number of threat actors operating in the cloud, and they usually leverage a newly dropped vulnerability either with or without a public exploit, and then they scan the internet for vulnerable servers, and then exploit the vulnerability to deploy malware, and a lot of the time is crypto mining malware. And the web applications are traditionally hosted on Linux server because of the ease of deployment and tools availability reasons from back in the days. So in this first scenario, I simulated a campaign where an attacker finds a vulnerable web service via reconnaissance, which is Spring Cloud Functions with CVE 2022-22963 in this case. And this web app is run inside a Docker container on a Linux server. The reason I chose Spring Cloud Function is because from my observation in production cloud infrastructure, Spring Cloud Function is used quite a bit for API gateways. Also, there are quite a few Spring Cloud Function vulnerabilities published from time to time. And this vuln particularly is rated by CISA as one of the top vulns being exploited in the wild. And then the container in this case uses the cgroup v1, so it's vulnerable to the cgroup release agent container escape. I also wanted to include a container escape in this simulation because there are times in the past where I encountered DevOps engineer mistakenly believe that container is a security boundary, and as you can see in the simulation, it's not. So my attack plan would be first exploit the CV. This vulnerability allows a user to provide a crafted spell, which is Spring expression language, using routing functionality to execute commands on the container. And then I use an exploit request to execute a wget command to drop a shell utility onto the container, establish a shell sessions from the container. After I have a shell session from the container, I will drop the cgroup release agent container escape exploit, and then execute it to escape out to the host, and then I'll establish another shell sessions from the host, persist on it with just a cron job, and then exfil data. So the first steps of this campaign I will need to exploit the CVE and leverage this code execution capability to drop a shell utility onto the container and establish a shell sessions. So as I mentioned previously, Spring Cloud Function is used regularly for API gateways. This vuln particularly allows users to provide a crafted Spring expression language using routing functionality to execute commands on the target host. So as a result, to exploit this vuln, I can issue a request, as you can see in this snippet here, to leverage this routing functionality to execute a command on the container. And to drop the shell utility onto the container, I executed that top exploit request to use wget to download a publicly available statically linked version of SOCAT onto dev SHM and then rename it. And then the next exploit request down is to copy bash from bin to dev SHM and also rename that. And then the last exploit request is to execute reverse shell with SOCAT. So I tested this masquerading principle by renaming and relocating the to execute reverse shell mechanism separately, and Falcon didn't alert on it. However, when I tested this step as part of the attack chain, Falcon actually generated 2 alerts. The first one is a high-severity wget malware download alert, no block, which means that Falcon let the execution happen. And then the second one is a critical level bash reverse shell alert block, meaning Falcon didn't let the execution happen. So I went back to the drawing board and do some debugging to see what really happened. Why did I get detected when I executed this as part of an attack chain? So my observation on this detection based on my past experience and experiments is that the wget malware download might have been triggered because of either the signature of the SOCAT binary or the location hosting the binary, which is the GitHub link, as you can see in the first code snippet there. Since this is a popular download link for SOCAT, perhaps a lot of threat actors also downloaded SOCAT from there, so that's why Falcon started flagging any instances of downloading SOCAT from that GitHub link. But Falcon didn't block it. So perhaps there are legitimate cases of downloading and executing SOCAT from there as well. And for the bash reverse shell alerts, as I previously mentioned, when I tested the reverse shell stuff by copying and renaming bash and SOCAT, it didn't generate any alert. However, when I executed it as part of the attack chain, Falcon started alerting on these reverse shell mechanisms. That's perhaps a state tracking capability where EDR associates related activities to a malicious one. So with the previous detection observations, I mapped out a couple of mutations. First, I'll have to get rid of the wget malware download alert, since that seems to be the root cause of everything from my observation and debugging. And my hypothesis is that it's mainly based on static signature of either the SOCAT binary or the GitHub locations. So one of the common techniques to get rid of signature is to introduce an abstraction layer, because with an abstraction layer, the signature of the binary completely changes. So to introduce an abstraction layer, I use Rust to write a minimal beacon with no obfuscation to reduce the footprint. I chose Rust because Rust technically has a very lightweight runtime, so that still provides me with an abstraction layer, but also it's lightweight, so it's still relatively fast. And the reason I opted for no obfuscation is because using obfuscation can actually increase the entropy scoring of the binary. So EDRs don't just look at what you're doing, but also how you're doing it. And certain actions really stand out to them are excessive string obfuscation, encryption, self-modifying code, etc. So using too much obfuscation can actually increase the likelihood of your binary being detected. So as you can see in this snippets here, these are the core functionalities of the beacon. They're fairly basic. Sends a GET request to beacon to get a command to run, then checks if the command is valid, and then execute the command, pulls the result back to result, and then sleeps for 10 seconds in between beacons. So with these new mutations, I executed the campaign again. First, exploit the CVE to drop the minimal Rust beacon onto the container and establish a shell sessions. So at this point, I didn't trigger the previous alerts anymore. And next, I will need to drop the container escape exploit onto the container, execute it to escape out to host as part of the full attack chain. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the campaign, the container uses cgroup v1, and it's vulnerable to the cgroup release agent escaped. So the way that cgroup release agent escape exploit works is it targets the cgroup v1's memory controller's release agent. And from the snippet of the exploit, as you can see, in the first snippet, it configures some of the environment variables. In this case, I created the unique sessions called brk, and then prepare to store the exploit script in .brk.sh, and then use the def shm.brk as the cgroup mount point. Then launch a background process so that there's something to kill within the cgroup later. This is actually required to trigger release agent. The second snippet down is to write the payload script to be executed on host using heredoc. And then the third script created a malicious cgroup by mounting a new memory cgroup at def shm.brk, and then sets notifying on release to 1. So when the last process in the cgroup exits, the kernel triggers the release agent. And then finally, the last snippet is to abuse release agents by writing a path inside a guest process root file system as the release agent. Since the containers have isolated file systems, using proc PID root let attackers reference their container path from the host context. So now with a better understanding of the container, how the container escape exploit works, let's continue with the attack chain executions. So again, I exploited the CVE, dropped the Rust beacon, established shell sessions, dropped the container escape exploit onto the container, executed to escape out to the host, and to my surprise, Falcon actually generated a high-severity container escape alert, and it was blocked. I was surprised because when I tested this exploit separately, Falcon didn't alert on it. And in general, EDRs don't generally detect exploits. They focus on post-exploitation activities. So I went back to the drawing board again to debug what really happened. So again, drawing from past experiments, there are several things that could have caused these detections. One is that this could be a residual effect from my previous testing, where I used the detected SOC sessions to download the container escape exploit onto the container. So Falcon associated the container escape script to the detected SOC utility and determined that it was malicious. Also, I debugged the exploit script again step by step and determined that Falcon detected the exploit at the mount step, where I mounted the new memory cgroup at def shm.brk. So with this new observation, I started working on some mutations again. The goal here is to downgrade or get rid of the container escape alert altogether. There are a couple of malware dev principles I can use here, but the one I opted for is to reduce TTP footprint. And the simplest way to reduce TTP footprint is to refactor it into smaller files. So that will change the signatures of the files completely. So I refactored the container escape exploits into four smaller scripts. The first script there is to, again, set up some environment variables. The second script is launching a dummy process, and then use heredoc to base64 decode the ENC environment variable, and generated another bash script to execute once escaped from the container. And this script on host will install reverse shell utility using package manager, move it to another directory, rename it, and do the same sequence for bash. Third script there is to mount the cgroup memory controller, and the last script is to trigger release agent to escape and perform actions on host. So as you can see here, it's pretty much the same code with a few things renamed and refactored, basically. So with the refactor scripts for container escape, executed the attack chain again, exploit CV, drop the minimal Rust beacon, establish shell sessions, and then from the shell sessions, drop the refactor scripts onto the container, execute the container escape, and establish a shell session from host. And I didn't trigger the container escape alert anymore. So I moved on to the next step to persist on host with the cron job and exfil S3 data. And to persist on host, I created a simple cron job to establish a reverse shell to our C2 server. In this step, I used the living off the LAN principle to leverage package manager to install ANCAT, and then set up a cron job, which is a cron tab command. I also use a masquerading principle to copy and rename the ANCAT and bash utility to establish a reverse shell. So to reiterate on our refactor escape scripts that I presented previously, the first script is to set up some environment variables, right? And mainly here it contains an ENC environment variable which contains a base64 encoded blob. And then the second script will launch a dummy process and use HereDoc to base64 decode ENC environment variable and generate another bash script to be executed on host once escaped from the container. And that generated bash script is that last box in there at the bottom of the screen. And this script on host will just install ANCAT using the package manager, move it to another directory, rename it, and do the same sequence for bash, and then create a cron job to execute reverse shell repeatedly. And to exfil data from the S3 buckets, again, I use the living off the LAN principle to leverage the AWS SDK to blend in, and the abstraction layer principle by using the Rust SDK specifically. And as you can see in the snippet there, I created a command line utility with three main functions to list all S3 buckets, create access key to backdoor an IAM user, and download all objects from an S3 bucket. And the final result is that of the attack chain is I didn't trigger any more alerts from Falcon. When I tried the full attack chain on SentinelOne, I got one suspicious alert with 2 threat indicators, as you can see in the screenshots there, without being blocked, which means that SentinelOne didn't block the execution, they simply alerted on it. And on Defender, the attack chain didn't trigger any alert. So back to Rex to talk about detections.
Wow, that's eye-opening, Con. And I feel my SOC is running blind. This is a reaction when we showed this to some of the SOC team. But let's think about how to actually address the problem. And detection engineering is a very big and complex topic. For the interest of time, please allow us to just compress in 2 dimensions. One is, hey, when we build detections, we want to build detections that are more generic or specific, and we care about the efficacy of the detection. So if we use these 2 dimensions to see what we can do here, the first example is, hey, maybe we can detect this particular release agent escape. Now, if we do that, there are certain type of false positive that is a legitimate use of release agent. However, with some kind of profiling, we should be able to come up with an unusual type of process that is triggering the release agent. So it's specific, but with some tuning, the efficacy can be high depending on the environment. Some other ideas about detecting these TTPs are if we can detect the installation of the reverse shell utility. Now, as you can probably see, this is very specific to either the installation, checking the installation log, or specific to the command line. Now, if the utility is already installed on the box, then we won't be able to detect it. Now, the last thing we may be able to do here is detect the binary that is copied, the legitimate binary that is copied out of the default location. Now, as some of you probably know, that this can be very, very specific and also can be noisy as well. So across the entire talk, you will see that in the next story as well. The techniques that we use is really trying to push these TTPs towards the direction where the detection need to come up with something specific, and also it blends in, so the efficacy is actually low. And with that, I will hand over to Kan to talk about the next scenario.
All right. So our next example will be a threat actor targeting a Windows endpoint. So the threat actors operating in this area are the usual suspect, APT groups, Russia, China, North Korea, as well as the financially motivated groups like Fin6, Fin7. The general steps of an attack campaign targeting Windows endpoint have been more or less the same for a decade now. However, the most innovation that I've seen in this type of campaigns is in spear phishing and initial access areas. So threat actors have been adopting like uncommon file formats to avoid being detected, and then leveraging more living off the land vectors, right? So some of the file formats that have been particularly popular among threat actors are zip format, although it seems to be falling out of favor, ISO format, LNK format, etc. So if we have to generalize this type of campaign, it generally goes as like spear phishing email being sent to a victim containing a link or attachment to download like an ISO file. And when the user double clicks on the ISO file, it mounts to the file system as an external drive. And then some new files will appear in this drive. In some of these campaigns, it's usually a DLL file and an LNK file. Depends on the execution that the threat actors intended to run next. And the LNK file is usually disguised as another format. A lot of the times it will appear as like something .pdf with a PDF logo. So user will double click on this fake PDF file. It will perform some actions in the background to establish a shell sessions back to the threat actor C2 server. And then the threat actor persists and escalate privilege with the usual methods. And then they either exfil data or move laterally, depends on their goals. So to simulate this type of campaigns, I use a Windows endpoint that resembles a typical enterprise Windows machine these days. Like it has a regular user, an admin user, has a vulnerable custom service installed by the admin named IT Monitor Service. It has some enterprise applications installed like Office, Slack, OneDrive, etc. And obviously it has EDRs in there. So with this environment setup, my attack plan would be first, the user will download and double clicks on a fake meeting invite, which is an ISO file in this case. After they double clicks on the ISO files, it mounts to the file system as an external drive. The user will see a fake PDF file in there, which is actually an LNK file and a TXT file in the drive. After the user double clicks on the PDF file, shell sessions will be established back to my C2 server, and then I'll enumerate system services to find a vulnerable service, and then once I find one, I'll exploit it to escalate privilege and persist. Since a system service is started at boot, it serves a double purpose for me as an attacker. So lastly, I'll exfil some data. So with that attack plan, my first few steps will be user downloads my ISO file, double clicks on it, and then they will see my fake PDF file, they double clicks on that, and then I get a shell. So let's talk a little bit about how I generated this initial access chain, right? So as you can see in the top screenshot there, I use OSCD image to generate the meeting invitation.iso file from the content of the meeting invites folder. And in the bottom screenshot, you can see the meeting invite folder, which has two files. One is the invitation letter.pdf file, and the other one is document.txt. But if you pay closer attention, you'll see that the invitation letter.pdf file is actually a shortcut file, which is an LNK file. And I'll show you in a little bit, the document.txt file is not simply a text document. So let's dive into the LNK file. So LNK file is a Windows shortcut file. It's commonly used to point to a file or a folder or executable without duplicating the actual targets. But it can also embed commands that run when the file is open, so that's why it's the attacker's favorite go-to. So in the top box, you'll see how I generated this ELNK file. And the command it actually runs is -svr32.exe with some option like -s, -n, -u, -i, document.txt with scrobject.dll. So this is actually a common living off the land technique abusing -svr32. So -svr32 is a signed Microsoft utility to register and unregister COM DLLs, and scrobject.dll is Microsoft scriptlet component runtime. And document.txt is actually an SCT script, which is a Windows script component file in the XML format. And in the bottom box, you can see the actual content of the document.txt file, which runs a remote PowerShell script. And now with the understanding of what actually being run in the background, let's go back to the attack chain. So again, the user double-clicks on my meeting invitation.iso file, it bounces to the file system as an external drive. The user then sees a fake PDF file and a TXT file, and then they double-click on my fake PDF file. And then at this point, Defender generated a suspicious LN case execution from container alert. This is a low-severity, no-block alert, which means that Defender detected it, but they didn't block it, so I still got a shell back from the machine with Defender. And Falcon generated a P-shell download medium severity alert, but it actually blocks it. So I didn't get a shell back from the machine with Falcon. So based on my observations, Falcon only generated a medium severity, but it blocks executions. So perhaps the Falcon setup that I tested on is pretty strict towards PowerShell execution, or it could be the combinations of Rex SVR32 and remote PowerShell. So as a result, my goal here is to avoid P-shell download alert. So to mutate the TTP, I go back to some core principles. Again, first, introduce an abstraction layer. From the last campaign, using Rust was enough of an abstraction layer for me. So perhaps I could just probably leverage the old minimal Rust beacon I used for the last campaign. But how should I use it is the big questions. Also, I still want to use living off the land, but perhaps Resh SVR32 is too common of an living off the land technique for EDR to detect, right? So I had to pivot to something else that's commonly installed on an enterprise system, but not a common enough angle for EDR to detect. So if you think about a modern enterprise system, right, so Electron apps are probably the most common thick application installed on an endpoint these days. So think of like Slack, Teams, Notion, and so on. So that settles it for living off the land. I'll hijack Slack. So let's talk a little bit about how Electron app hijacking works. So as I mentioned previously, most common thick applications these days are written in Electron, which supports Node.js, and Node.js supports native add-ons, allowing users to extend module functionality using share objects. So things like DLL on Windows or SO files on Linux. So I can masquerade a DLL file as a .node file, which is the extension file format of node extensions. So in this case, I compiled the old Rust beacon to a DLL file using NAPI, short for Node API. It's a C-based API provided by Node.js to allow native code like C++ or Rust to interact safely with the JavaScript runtime across platforms, as you can see in the top snippet there. And then I renamed the DLL to index.node in the second snippet. And then I modified the LNK generation to drop the node extensions to a Slack's module directory, which is the registry.js module in this case, as you can see in the last snippet. So with this new mutation, I executed the attack chain again. Again, first, the user double-clicks on my meeting invitation.iso file, mouse to the file system as an external drive. User sees my fake PDF file, which is an LNK file, and the index.node file. They double-clicks on the invitation.pdf file, which drops the node extension to the Slack's module directory. So when Slack launches, I got a shell session back. So up to this point, I no longer trigger any alert from Falcon. So I move on to the next steps, which are enumerating system services to find a vulnerable one to exploit to escalate privilege and persist. So with the shell session established, I simply use getWMI object to enumerate system services, as you can see in the top snippet there. And then I found a service named IT Monitor with an unquoted service path in the second snippet. So unquoted service path is somewhat of a common misconfiguration in Windows services. So in Windows, when a service executable path contains space but is not surrounded by quotes, Windows may interpret the path incorrectly. So in this particular case, the IT Monitor service is supposed to run itmonitor_service.exe from the C IT service IT tools directory. However, since the service path is unquoted, I exploited this misconfiguration by simply simply placing a file named it.exe inside the IT service directory, and Windows will just run my it.exe file when the service starts instead of the intended it-monitor_service.exe file. And the way I implemented this it.exe file is, as you can see in the last snippet there, is simply I wrote a basic Windows service in Rust with the name it-monitor with some core functionalities like defined Windows service, main, my service main, run service, and register control handler. So in the run service function, I set up a launcher script in the temp directory to run a remote PowerShell script. And the remote PowerShell code follows the same principles that I used for Bash in the previous campaign, which is refactoring into smaller pieces of code to reduce footprint. So in the last step, I searched for the file documents, for files with document extensions in documents directory and exfil them to S3 buckets. And the final result is I didn't trigger any more alerts from any of the 3 EDRs. So back to Rex to talk about detection in this campaign.
OK, thank you, Khan. Yet another eye-opening result. Let's take a look at what we can detect from this. So the first thing we can detect is a very specific to this attack scenario. We can detect file creation with file name containing PDF. But it actually ends with an LNK file. The second thing we can detect is we can detect an unusual process writing into uncoded device path. And again, this will be a specific detection. In addition, it will require profiling about what unusual process means in a particular system. So it will take some time to tune and build this detection. And the last one is unusual process writing into Electron app directory. Again, this will require profiling on what unusual process is, given that Electron app directory can have many different application processes writing into it. This rule can also require a lot of effort to tune and maintain. So with that said, come to the takeaway. So we have experimented 4 different principles to downgrade and evade EDR detections. The first principle is living off the land, basically leverage existing operating system utility as much as we can in the threat operation. The second one is footprint reduction. So for a particular sequence of actions, the attacker can chop these actions into very small chunks and execute it one at a time in order to reduce the footprint. The next principle is abstraction. Attacker can leverage higher-level languages to rewrite the same TTP such that they can downgrade or bypass file-related kind of detections. And the last one is masquerading, involve mutating file names and file paths for important system utilities. While we demonstrate practical ways to leverage this principle, at the same time, how do we actually detect and protect the organization, right? In order to actually combat these attacks, the SOC team need to configure custom detection rules to actually improve the detection coverage. Fortunately and unfortunately, most of these rules, as you can see, may end up being medium low severity. So in order to actually fully close the gap, the SOC team cannot just ignore these medium low severity alerts. And there need to be a way to leverage automation and even AI to be able to investigate all the credible alerts. We actually have done other experiments that, due to the interest time, not able to share, but happy to share more in the offline discussion. And with that, happy to answer any questions.